In March 1945, the air inside a stone basement in Koblenz, Germany, smells of damp lime, stale sweat, and cheap carbolic soap. Wounded civilians and abandoned soldiers lie side by side along the sweating walls. Stepping through the cracked entry arch is a three-star American general, surrounded by armed staff officers whose boots crunch on shattered glass. Out of the shadows steps Klaus Schmidt. He is 17 years old, wearing a frayed Wehrmacht tunic stripped of insignia, his hands trembling against his hips. Tied around his left upper arm is a makeshift Red Cross armband, crude cross-stitching, pulled unevenly over the faded pattern of a ripped bedsheet. He steps directly into the general's path, ignoring the leveled carbines of the escort, and raises his hands to ask for morphine and cotton bandages for the basement floor. The American officers freeze, hands drop to holster flaps. The air in the narrow passageway grows dense as every man calculates how fast a commander known for ruthless discipline will crush a defeated enemy soldier who dares speak out of turn. General George S. Patton stands unmoving in the dim light. He looks down at the boy, his face unreadable, his polished helmet catching the gray glow from the street above. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether 17 human lives in that basement survived the night. And the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second. Because to understand what it cost Klaus Schmidt to step in front of 3 stars and a wall of loaded carbines, you need to understand what a basement clinic in Koblenz was in March 1945. It was not a hospital. It was a holding box for the dying. The stone walls sweat cold water, turning coal dust and dried blood into a dark slime along the baseboards. There were no white sheets, no clean surgical trays, and no light except for yellow oil lamps that sputtered when artillery shells landed 2 blocks away. The air was thick with the stink of wet wool, gangrene, and unwashed fear. Dozens of people lay wedged together on straw pallets, including wounded elderly women, children with shrapnel torn through their winter coats, and teenage conscripts whose uniforms were barely broken in. The unwritten rules of that space were simple and absolute. When enemy troops cleared a town, you shrank into the shadows. You did not stand up. You did not speak unless spoken to. And above all, you never stepped toward an officer whose army had spent the last 3 weeks battering your city into gravel. A defeated soldier asking an advancing commander for military supplies was not just breaking protocol. It was a breach of military logic so total that nobody in that cellar had a category for it. Surrendered personnel were meant to form lines, keep their hands visible, and wait for processing. The American officers walking into that basement were scanning for threats, snipers, and booby traps. They were not expecting an unarmed 17-year-old in a threadbare tunic to block their path and demand medical gear. Every staff officer in that escort performed the exact same instant calculation. They saw an enemy combatant stepping too close to the commanding general of the Third Army. By March 1945, the arithmetic of the Western Front had reached a brutal breaking point. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the French ports. Every single crate of morphine, every roll of sterile gauze, and every bottle of plasma brought across the Rhine was calculated down to the last ounce. American medical battalions were running short on basic dressings for their own front-line infantry, and every truck haul was a high-stakes balance of fuel, tonnage, and time. To hand over 2 crates of critical medical inventory to a cellar full of enemy civilians and surrendered conscripts was an accounting error that no supply officer could justify on paper. The operational math dictated that resources flowed strictly forward to support the advance, not sideways into the ruined basements of a fallen German city. And that was the room Klaus Schmidt raised his hand in. Picture the scene. The cellar held 24 wounded people, packed so tightly on damp straw that walking through meant stepping on the edges of overcoats. 2 yellow oil lamps hung from low joists, throwing long shadows across limestone walls that dripped continuous condensation. Standing near the bottom of the stone stairs was Captain Arthur King of the 304th Medical Battalion. He watched the escort team halt, their carbines lowered but ready, their boots slick with river mud. In the tight space, the distance between the 3-star general and the teenage enemy combatant was less than 6 feet. Every officer standing in that damp passage understood the delicate geometry of the moment. The staff officers were watching the boy, but they were privately calculating the commander. They knew the history. They knew how fiercely the general protected American medical priority, and they knew his absolute refusal to tolerate delays or diversions during an offensive, but they also knew the sheer unpredictability of his presence in a forward zone. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a pistol. But nobody relaxed their shoulders either. The silence in the cellar was complete, broken only by the wet, rasping breath of an old woman in the corner. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that basement in Koblenz are remarkably consistent in shape. Patton did not yell. He did not issue a stern lecture on military protocol, or remind the boy which army had lost the war. Not the way a general looks at an interruption, not the way a man looks at something that has irritated him. He looked at Klaus Schmidt the way he looked at terrain, measuring the mud, the inclination, and the structural integrity of the ground beneath his feet. Slowly, without taking his eyes off the 17-year-old, Patton turned his head toward the stairs and signaled his escort driver with a sharp, downward jerk of his chin. He spoke only 4 words, his voice flat, sharp, and cut like iron. "Bring down 2 crates." 2 armed infantrymen scrambled back up the stone steps, their boots slipping on the slick gravel outside. Less than 2 minutes later, they descended back into the dim basement carrying 2 wooden medical supply boxes stamped with the white star of the Third Army. They set them heavily on the damp dirt floor, right between the general and the boy. Patton looked at the crates, then stepped forward until he was standing directly over Klaus. He pointed a single gloved finger at the crates, looked the young medic dead in the eyes, and said, "Save who you can." Then, without waiting for a salute or a word of thanks, Patton turned on his heel and walked back up the stairs into the gray light of Koblenz, his staff officers scrambling to catch up. Captain Arthur King described that exit with one word: deliberate. Patton did not look back, and he did not glance at his supply officers to see if they were logging the inventory loss. Now, here's the thing. What Patton understood in that brief exchange was something that every officer in that cellar had completely missed. He did not see an enemy soldier attempting to negotiate terms or exploit American generosity. He recognized the cold, unsentimental mechanics of immediate field triage. In the brutal arithmetic of high-intensity warfare, a commander who stops to weigh ideology against an active medical crisis is wasting time he does not have. Patton knew that 17 dying people in a basement near an active supply route were a structural hazard to his rear echelon, left untreated. That room would become a logistical nightmare within 12 hours. By handing over 2 crates of surplus dressings, he instantly solved a localized operational problem without spending a single man-hour of American medical labor. It was not an act of soft sentimentality. It was the sharp, quiet efficiency of a senior commander who recognized a competent worker doing a job that needed to be done, regardless of the uniform he wore. Before the war broke out across the Rhineland, Klaus Schmidt was not a soldier, a medic, or a prisoner. He was a 17-year-old student from a quiet tree-lined street in Leipzig, the son of a master bookbinder who spent his evenings teaching his boy how to stitch leather and repair torn parchment. His mother worked as a pharmacy clerk, and it was from her that Klaus learned how to mix simple salves, roll clean linen bandages, and measure drops of tincture with steady fingers. He had planned to study chemistry at the university after finishing his gymnasium exams. He had a younger sister named Minna, who collected pressed wildflowers, and a classmate named Clara, who worked in her family's bakery, whose letters Klaus carried tucked behind his paybook until the ink ran smudged from cellar dampness. When the drafting notice arrived in late 1944, he was handed a threadbare tunic, 2 weeks of hurried training, and sent to the front not as an infantryman, but as a unit medic. He was not a hero. He was the kind of person who looked at a broken spine or an open artery and saw a problem that required order, clean water, and deliberate hands. When Klaus later learned that the gray-haired American general who stood over those supply crates was George S. Patton, his response was completely without drama. He did not boast, and he did not write home about meeting a famous commander. He simply unbuckled the wooden crates, sorted the morphine vials by concentration, and spent the rest of the night wrapping fresh sterile gauze over the torn limbs of 17 human beings. Captain Arthur King survived the crossing of the Rhine and returned home to Ohio in the fall of 1945, opening a general medical practice where he worked until his retirement 30 years later. In his private journals, discovered by his family decades after the war, King wrote that of all the tactical movements and high-level decisions he witnessed while serving with the Third Army, the single moment that stuck in his mind was the image of an American general, leaving 2 crates of medical gear on the dirt floor of a ruined basement in Koblenz, and a 17-year-old boy in a bedsheet armband immediately going back to work. Was General Patton right to hand 2 crates of operational medical supplies to a surrendered enemy medic? Some would say no. In the unforgiving math of high-intensity warfare, military supplies are meant strictly for advancing frontline units. And giving vital inventory to an enemy combatant violates protocol, risks resource diversion, and weakens logistics. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that Patton recognized an act of raw pragmatic duty, solving an immediate humanitarian and logistical disaster behind his lines with 2 crates that saved 17 lives. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.